Hi, welcome to Kenton and Habiba. My name is Habiba and today I thought I would give you a different type of video. This is usually a vlog channel and my husband and I document our lives with our family living in North Carolina. But I thought I would give you a different type of video because many of you don't really know who we are and in particular who I am. It's interesting, the most common question I often get is, where are you from? You know, what is your race? How did you get to the United States? So I thought I would put it together in this video and share it with you. Hopefully someone out there will be inspired. It's also, you know, important to me to do this because it is something that has been sort of weighing on my heart. I've always wanted to really talk about it and put it out there, but I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable because I feel that in order to talk about myself or in order to share who I am, I really also have to talk about my parents, and I've always wanted to, you know, sort of protect their privacy. But I'm hoping that you will take this for what it is. It has been my experience, my reality, and this is in no way meant to hurt anyone in particular, because I'm sure there are people who are from the country that I came from who might be a little bit sensitive or taken aback. But again, this is just me sharing. Hopefully this will not only help me, but also help whoever is watching. And I also hope one day my children will be able to watch this and know what my story was. Because, you know, young kids, you tell them one thing, it doesn't mean they're going to remember. Or at least know the details as you recall. So, first of all, I was born in London, England. My parents were a young couple and very much in love. My father was from West Africa, Nigeria. So he is from the northern part of Nigeria, Hausa, and Nigeria was colonized by the British. So he always spoke English and was well educated and was in England studying engineering. My mother was from a Caribbean family but was raised in England, and so at the time she was a secretary and was working when she met my father. So my parents got together. My mother looks very much like an Indian person, but she, you know, was raised in England, and so grew up around mostly Caucasian people. So I believe when she met my father, I always used to joke that it was like curiosity killed a cat, because he was basically the first black guy she had ever dated. And they fell in love, they got married. As far as I know, it wasn't a elaborate wedding. It was a wedding in a courthouse. Eventually, my brother and myself were born. So they were a very young couple, and they were from completely different cultures. And so why, again, I talk about them is because in order to sort of see where I came from and why I ended up where I am now, you have to kind of understand the cultural conflicts between my parents and their background. So they were both of a different religion, and also of a totally different culture, even though on the outside, superficially, they were both black. Although most of the time people did not know what race my mother was or assumed she wasn't black, but she's black. So there was always this conflict or real difference in culture. And I think as the children got older, it started to manifest itself even more. And for anyone that's a parent, you know that is true when, you know, as a young person, you may not necessarily know what your values are or what your beliefs are. And then when children come into the picture, you become a little bit more conservative and you start to sort of define what you think is appropriate. So my parents basically lived in England, and eventually my dad needed to go back to Nigeria. So my mom had parents who were Caribbean, but also living in England at the time. And I imagine they were not happy that my mother would need to go to Africa. And I think they really didn't want her to go to Africa. They were afraid for her. Of course, keep in mind, this was back in the 70s, and most people don't know or didn't know anything about Africa, or they always just assume the negative things that you see on television or read. You know, everybody is wild, people live in huts, nobody has a car and things like that. I mean, some of that might be true in some of the remote parts of, you know, the continent, but I would say for the majority of people, there are modern amenities. I mean, there are houses, there are everything that you would find in the Western world pretty much exists in Africa. Obviously, maybe not to the same extent or degree. Anyway, so eventually my mom decided she was going to go to Africa with my father. We were very young. It was just me and my brother. And at this point, we're about 2, 3, 4. And so because she was very unsure about, you know, what Africa was going to be like, she wasn't sure whether she was going to like it. She wasn't sure whether she would want to stay. She decided to leave my brother and I with her great-grandmother. So with her grandmother, our great-grandmother. So we actually stayed, my brother and I, in England with my great-grandmother while my mother went on to Africa with my father. And I can imagine that had to be very scary. Keep in mind, my mother was young. She was just about 20 at this point, and she had 2 kids, and she's going off to, you know, another part of the world where she has absolutely no family. She does not speak the language, you know, and she's going with her young husband who she really doesn't know anything about his culture. Because keep in mind, my dad in England, or when my dad would travel, he was a little different. He was very westernized. He was well educated. He pretty much knew how to blend in with everybody else. But going back to Nigeria, going back to northern part of Nigeria, which is very conservative, where women generally are covered up, where women at that time really did not have a voice, it was just a completely different world. She went, I guess, you know, things worked out, or she felt like this was somewhere she could live. So she eventually sent for us. And I'm just going to show you a picture that I found of my brother and I when, you know, she came to pick us up. So this here, I don't know if you could see, hopefully it'll focus. That's a picture of my brother and myself. So there's my brother. He's younger than I, and that's me. And you'll see that he has a huge fro. That was all his hair. My brother, who is a little different, basically stopped talking once my mom left. So he stopped talking, and my grandmother or great-grandmother thought that if she didn't cut his hair, that, you know, somehow that was related to him not talking. If she didn't cut his hair, he would start talking. I don't know, you know, if you know that tradition or that culture. But anyway, Oma had long hair, even longer than mine. So eventually we moved to Nigeria. My mom and my father, and we grew up. And I think looking back, you know, when we were young, life was fine. You know, there was nothing we didn't want. Just to give you an idea, you know, we always lived in fairly decent large houses. In Nigeria, it's not uncommon for people to have maids or housekeepers or houseboys, as you would call them. So we always had that. My father always had nice cars, flashy cars every few years. He wasn't a very flashy person, but he could afford nice cars every now and then. So we lived pretty well. I definitely feel like as children, there really wasn't anything we didn't want. We didn't, you know, there was nothing we wanted and couldn't have. Anyway, over time, I think some of the problems started to show as we got a little older. There were things like, for example, my mom eventually got pregnant with my youngest brother. So I have two brothers. And my father insisted that his father, my grandfather, who was the patriarch at the time, insisted that my youngest brother be born in Nigeria, because I guess they felt that the two other children were born outside of the country and they wanted a child that was fully Nigerian, you know, that he needed to be born there. And I remember my mom being really, really upset and crying because she really wanted to go, you know, back to an area that she was familiar, back to England to have the child, but he wouldn't have that. So anyway, my youngest brother was born in Nigeria. And, you know, at that point, eventually I ended up going to secondary school. I ended up going to FGC Sokoto, which was a really good school. But I think culturally it was still very difficult for me. And what I mean by that is that I was always a very small child. I was always very timid because culturally I had what my mother was teaching me, then I had what the society, the culture there demanded. And if you know anything about northern Nigeria, it is very traditional. They are Muslim, and I was always the type of child that knew too much, understood too much, because my Western mother would tell me everything. If I had a question, my mom was the type of person that would explain and tell me everything. So I was never naive to how things worked or how babies were born or anything about sex. It was just, that's the kind of relationship I had with my mom. Now that didn't translate very well in northern Nigeria, because I would, you know, share that information with my friends if they asked me at something. You know, if they didn't understand something, I would explain. And I would get in trouble for knowing that information. I would get in trouble with some of my older cousins. You know, I basically, after a while, realized that I needed to keep my mouth shut and I needed to sort of fall in line and learn to be like everybody else. In essence, not be myself. I became more and more fearful, partly because of the culture, partly because I was fearful of my father, to be honest, often, partly because as I approached puberty, one of the things that I was very aware of was arranged marriages, and that is something that I just really did not want to be a part of. And not only arranged marriages, which, you know, I'm sure is still done, but maybe not as commonly as it used to be done. But the other thing is, for most girls in northern Nigeria, when you have a period, or when your period approaches, you are seen as a woman. Like, you are literally seen as a woman and potential marriage material. So I remember being terrified that my period had come and I could not let my father know. I could not let his family know, because I knew what would happen. So I remember telling my mother to promise me she was not going to tell my father and not going to tell anybody that I'd had my period. I was literally terrified, because you also have to understand, at that point, my father came from a very large family, and my grandfather pretty much had the say as to how all the children, the extended family, where they went to school, who they married, what was going to happen. I had a lot of female cousins, so I had seen examples. This was not like in the Western world where the mother has the say and where the mother plays, a large part in what happens in your child's future. In northern part of Nigeria, the men pretty much are considered the main focal figure, and the men pretty much own the children. So for the most part, my mom was starting to realize and starting to feel like she was losing control of her children. She really didn't have a say in where we went to school, in what happened to us after school, in when we were to get married, and things like that. So as time progressed, my dad also had started to change jobs. He had moved to a different area because, he had more opportunities. And every time he moved, he would want my mother to move with him. Now, a few years before we left, my mom did not really want to move to this particular area because it was very rural at the time, and she liked her job. She was very independent. She worked at a university, and she really did not want to have to not be able to work, not have her own money. And she, had gotten settled there. The children were in school, but my father really wasn't happy about that. So I, as a child, had a lot of anxiety. I had a lot of anxiety about my parents and a lot of the conflict. Then over time, my parents liked to travel, like I said, but my father would prefer to leave us with his parents or with someone else than take us. So we started to feel like it was clear, at least to me and to my brothers, that my father, part of it perhaps was cultural, but my father was always in love with my mother, was incredibly possessive of my mother, but the kids became this sort of side product. We weren't necessarily, something that my father wanted to take with him everywhere. Now, I know there's some of you that will say, well, that was just cultural. Nigerian fathers or northern fathers aren't very affectionate and all of that. And that might be true. And also as a parent, I know what it is where the love that you have for your spouse and the love that you have for your children is completely different. But this was different. This was not just about a different type of love. This was the fact that as children, we felt like we were in the way, and that my father would rather not go anywhere with us if he had a chance. He just wanted to be with my mother. So that could be very toxic because my mother was a very sociable person. She was a very attractive woman. She had a lot of friends, and some of these friends were men who weren't, who were just foreigners who had come to Nigeria and were introduced to her because she was also foreign and she had married a Nigerian man, and she would know, a little bit about the area. So through her job, she got to know a lot of people that were from different parts of the world. And so my dad became incredibly possessive and overly jealous at times. And so the children, myself in particular, pretty much got the brunt of his anger when he was upset. If he didn't know where my mother was, or if he didn't know what she was doing or what he thought she was doing. So it became a very unhealthy environment. Let's put it that way. It became a very unhealthy environment. So again, I just want to say that this is my truth. This is how what life was for me. I'm not saying this is what life was like for most Nigerians. And I'm not saying that every Nigerian man is this way. And I'm not saying that my father is this way now. You know, I don't know him now. I really don't know him now. I know where he is, and we have casual conversation on Facebook, but I don't really know him anymore. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it became a very unhealthy relationship. There was the conflict with my parents. There was the jealousy. There was the fact that I had become at the age where marriage was something they were considering, and I was 15 going 16, and that was definitely not what I wanted. I wanted to go to school. I wanted an education in a place that I wanted, and so I always dreamed about going to the United States. And luckily for us, my mother's parents at this point lived in the United States. So we decided that we were going to, on our next trip to the United States, we were going to stay. Now, of course, we could not tell my father, hey, we want to go to the United States, because that was not going to happen. That was not going to happen. He didn't even want to move to a bigger city that my mother would have preferred. It was just very difficult. And so despite the material things that we had, because there are people who I heard were saying that, you know, my father had married a foreign woman and she stole his kids. This is the story that I've heard went around once we left. My mother did not steal her kids. My mother protected her kids and took us away because we wanted to go. And that's the honest truth. I prayed. I remember praying outside, sitting on a car outside in the dark, praying that, please, Lord, I want to live in the United States. I want an education. I want a sense of freedom. I felt so restricted. I felt so confined, living in a culture that, despite it being my father's culture and despite it being the culture that I had known from about age 4 and 5 all the way till 15, because we lived in Nigeria for 11 years, despite that being the primary culture, it never felt fully me. And part of that was because I had the influence of my mother's Western culture, and also meeting children from different parts of the world, because I was always friends with foreign kids. I've always been, and I know that what we did leaving Nigeria without my father knowing about our plans, he didn't know. I know that that was the biggest shock, the biggest disappointment for him. I know that. And I have no regrets. I really have no regrets. When we moved to the United States, I think my mom hoped that eventually my dad would want to move here and, you know, want to live here, but he didn't. And I understand, because he had a large family. His father was still in Nigeria, and for them culturally, it wouldn't have been looked at well for him to go after a woman, even though this woman was his wife and he had 3 children with her. So I think my mother always thought that maybe he would come, and she wanted him to come, but he just couldn't get himself to come. So for a while, I think, me personally, because I can only talk for myself, I think I was a little bit angry, because despite wanting to get away from, you know, northern part of Nigeria, despite that, and despite my fears and sometimes my reservations about my father, who could be very aggressive at times, I still thought that he would come to the United States, and so I felt angry over the years when he didn't. So my mom basically turned into a single mother in the United States. But over time, we got over it. I think we picked ourselves up and we got over it. And after a while, I stopped caring. That's the truth. I really just stopped caring that my father wasn't here, because my grandfather, my mom's father, became a central father figure to us. School in Nigeria is very different than school in the United States. School in Nigeria, I remember being terrified. Yet again, is another area where I manifested a lot of anxiety. Nigerian teachers are very strict, and back then corporal punishment was allowed. I don't know if it still is, but I know that there, for example, let's say you were in chemistry class or biology class and the teacher asked you something and you didn't know the answer, whoosh, you were allowed to get whacked, basically flogged. So I was always terrified, because again, I had an understanding of how the world was outside of Nigeria because we had traveled a lot. So I was incredibly terrified most of the time. And I was a very hardworking student. I had always been on the top of the class, not necessarily the #1 student, but I was always one of top 5. And so I was very competitive, and if I didn't do well in school, or, you know, didn't do as well as I wanted, it really, really upset me. I remember having to walk to my father's office to show him my report card, and I am shaking, trembling, because my father was also very stern about our education, and rightfully so. I mean, I believe that as a parent now. So by the time we moved to the United States, I was 15 going 16. And I ended up going to Samuel J. Tilden High School. Now, Tilden, at this point, this is in the 80s, is basically in the ghetto, okay? So this was a huge cultural difference and cultural shock for me, because I had come from a place where, you know, I'd had a driver, and I had pretty much the security of my home. I had never taken the bus before. I had never basically had to walk down streets and be fearful of drugs and kids beating me up. So it was a huge change for my brothers and I. So at this point, Samuel J. Tilden, I was a junior in high school, which was something I was disappointed about. In Nigeria, I had graduated secondary school, which basically then leads to university because they follow the British system. So when we moved to the United States, I was told that I was too young. I was 16, too young to go to college or university here. And also there were certain requirements that they needed me to take. So, you know, initially I was very disappointed by that, but I think now looking back, it was the best thing, because it was the best way for me to acclimate into, you know, American society. And we were in New York City at that time. So I ended up going to high school in Brooklyn, and this is when crack was a big deal. So I remember literally standing at the bus stop and looking at crack vials on the floor. And thinking to myself, this is crazy. And it was. So, but I was very focused in school. I was very focused, and my mother did not let me date. I had friends, of course, this is United States, friends that at 16, 17, you know, girls are dating. My mother refused to let me date. And I remember, you know, that was a source of conflict, because I felt like, hey, I'm in the United States, I'm grown, you know, I don't have anybody to tell me what to do. Why can't I have a boyfriend? I remember this kid, he was from Guyana. I couldn't even understand what he was saying. He had the strangest accent to me. And he was smoking weed, and, you know, I just thought, wow, here's this kid doing his thing. He's cool. He likes me. He wants to go out on a date. Why can't I go? My mother was like, no way. And, you know, I thank God for that now, that she didn't let me go out there and just do what I wanted to do, because I was pretty headstrong. And, you know, instead, I became very focused again on school. Now, back in Nigeria, I had always thought that I was going to be an architect because I could draw pretty well and understood mechanical drawing and architectural drawing, and I loved that stuff. I also, at the time in Nigeria, was very afraid of hospitals because I'd had several experiences myself, which I will talk about in another video. I think I will talk to you about going to medical school in another video, or how I got to med school. So at this point, I am in high school, again in Tilden, and so we decide that I should go to medical school. My mom encourages me to consider medical school, and so I basically take all these pre-health or health classes, and I'm pre-med, and I end up in a program called Bridge to Medicine, which was a program at City College, and I would go to Harlem or somewhere near Harlem to take classes with other kids who were also interested in medicine. So that really kept me focused and busy. I didn't have time to date. I didn't do anything after school except something school related. When I look back now, I would say that, you know, New York City was a very fun and exciting, but also scary place. You know, I had come from a place where, again, I felt somewhat sheltered by a community where I had tons of relatives, a place where people were always watching you, how you dressed, how you spoke. You know, everything about you was monitored. You really could not be an individual in the same way you can be in the United States. In the United States, on the other hand, nobody gave a fuck. Excuse my language. Nobody gave a crap about you. You know, you could literally walk down the street naked and nobody seemed to care. People did what they want, said what they want, and so it was just one extreme to the other. And there were times where I did feel sad in the United States because I felt like we had come from this place where, you know, I was used to financially having what I wanted, to a place where now my mom was financially struggling. She was a single mom. We were living in a basement, her parents' basement. We were wearing secondhand clothes that were donated to us. And I remember feeling like, I can't believe this is what my life has come to. But I always felt like, I know that we are better than this. I know that we are better than what our circumstances are right now. And I always had hope that things would get better in the future. And I never stopped believing that. I always knew that this United States was the place that I would become who I was meant to be. And it's true. So I ended up basically going to high school. At this point, I had never really understood or dealt with racism. So, you know, coming from Nigeria, where everybody was black, and I say that in a good way because I never had any self-esteem issues, at least not related to my race. You know, my teachers were black, my president was black. So everything possible that I saw was performed by black people. I never had any question about what I could do based on my race. Usually my limitations at that point I thought were based on my gender, being female. So coming to the United States, I would say as a teenager, you sort of learn that you are inferior. You know, you as a black person are not expected to do so much. You are a minority. I'd never heard the term minority or understood minority meant that I was not, you know, the majority, and I was not expected to be as good as whites. And so that was very difficult to stomach. And so I remember in high school, I worked in the library. So after school, I worked in the library. And, you know, at this point, the great thing about going to a program, you know, this Bridge to Medicine program that we went to. It would take us to college tours. They helped us do our essays. This was a minority program. And so disadvantaged kids, you know, were basically given extra help to make sure that we got to college. So because of that experience, you know, I felt brave enough to apply to, you know, all these big colleges. And then on top of that, my mother, who was always, you know, my biggest cheerleader, encouraged me to apply to Cornell University. I remember when I told my librarian, or the guy that I was working with, that I had applied to Cornell, he told me, you know, why are you wasting your time? You know, you're coming from this ghetto school and you're a black girl. Why are you wasting your time trying to apply to Cornell? I've known white boys who applied and didn't get in, so you're wasting your time. And I remember feeling so broken. I went home and I told my mom that, you know, yes, you know, we were wasting our time. Because again, keep in mind, I had only been in this country for 2 years. So I was very naive and vulnerable, and you know, to have a white male tell me that I was wasting my time, I really believed him. So my mom, when I told her, she was like, stop listening to them, you know, stop listening to them. You need to focus. I know what you're capable of, and go ahead and apply. So, you know, I did, and lo and behold, I got in. So, you know, the moral of the story, I guess, is if you work hard and if you believe in yourself, you really are going to have to stop listening to the naysayers, because there will be tons of naysayers who don't believe what you're capable of doing. And, you know, I think that's what living in the United States really taught me, that if you work hard enough, chances are you will get as high as I basically made it to Cornell. And here's my degree, which I was very and that was my degree, which I was very proud of, because, you know, to think that I had only been in the United States for a few years, and here I was going to an Ivy League university, and it was the best experience. College for me was just like heaven opened up. I swear to God, it was like heaven opened up. Heaven and hell at times, because the work was really hard. But I was used to working hard. I was used to studying. But, you know, when you get to an Ivy League college or university like that, it's at a whole different level, because everybody there is smart. Everybody is smart. And on top of that, you know, I was coming now as this girl from the ghetto, from this, you know, broke down high school, to a place where kids who were children of presidents, children of prime ministers, children that were coming from some of the most affluent countries, and it could be a little bit intimidating. You know, I won't lie, it was a little bit intimidating at first. But the great thing about Cornell is you can also network with other minority students. I hate that word, minority students, but anyway, other students of color. You can network with them, and so you form a great bond with these students that are coming from other parts of New York City, other parts of the United States, or even, you know, other immigrants. And so I connected with a lot of immigrants, a lot of African students that I met, I connected with, and that really made my college experience that much better. Now, the great thing about Cornell, I remember, is there were so many courses, more courses than I could take in my lifetime, and that was just the best feeling, because I wanted to take science classes. I knew I was going to go to medical school. I wanted to take art classes. I wanted to do it all. And maybe the problem that I faced is that I could never just pick one path. I basically wanted to do it all. I realized, though, that because I was going to medical school, the opportunity to take art classes or to take, you know, theater classes would probably end at this point, and so this was the time to do it. So I took theater classes, I took drawing classes, I took art classes, I took Africana classes, and I also took my pre-med classes to prepare me for med school. So I think I'm going to stop here. I've said a lot. I hope it gives you a little bit more insight into who I am. In the next video, I will talk about getting into medical school and that experience, and of course meeting Kenton, because I did meet Kenton in Cornell. Oh, I actually have a picture. Let me show you. So this picture, I hope it's focused. Yeah. That picture was taken in 1991, I believe. So this was the year before I graduated Cornell, and that was my first trip to California. And so Kenton was my boyfriend at the time, and anyway, we'll talk about that in the next video. So I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I hope you leave me some comments or questions. It's fine. And I hope I haven't offended anyone, because that was really not my intention. My intention is just to share my story, as I said from the beginning. And I hope it inspires somebody. So God bless. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe. If you like these type of videos where I talk and I tell you, about my life, or if you have any questions or topics you want me to cover, please leave it in the comments below. And thank you for listening. God bless. Bye.